On a bitter February evening in 1975, the wind howled across the frozen plains of North Dakota like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter storm. The interstate stretched endlessly through the darkness, a black ribbon cutting through snow-dusted farmland where only the occasional farmhouse light pierced the desolate landscape. It was the kind of night that made travelers hurry toward their destinations, eager to escape the vast emptiness that seemed to swallow everything in its path. Rebecca Holloway had no way of knowing, as she adjusted the rearview mirror of her cherry-red Camaro and hummed along to Fleetwood Mac on the radio, that she was driving toward a fate that would haunt the Red River Valley for decades to come. The 19-year-old college student from Fargo had made this drive dozens of times before, straight south on Highway 81 toward Grand Forks, then east toward Duluth, where her boyfriend waited. It should have been a simple 4-hour journey through familiar territory. But tonight, something was watching from the shadows of the desolate truck stops and abandoned grain elevators that dotted the frozen landscape. Something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment, the perfect victim. Rebecca's long blonde hair caught the glow of the dashboard lights as she reached forward to turn up the heater. The Camaro's engine purred confidently, its custom license plates golden 1, reflecting the sparse highway lighting as she maintained a steady 70 miles per hour. Her parents had given her the car for her 18th birthday, and she'd personalized it with fuzzy dice and a lavender air freshener that now swayed gently with each curve in the road. She was supposed to meet Tommy Richardson at his apartment near the University of Minnesota Duluth campus by midnight. They had been dating for 8 months, and this weekend was special. She was finally going to introduce him to her parents when they drove back to Fargo together on Sunday. Rebecca had even bought a new dress for the occasion, carefully folded in her overnight bag in the back seat. The storm front was moving in faster than the weather service had predicted. By the time Rebecca passed through the small farming community of Grafton, snow was beginning to swirl across her windshield in hypnotic patterns. She considered pulling over to call Tommy from a payphone, but the next town was only 30 miles ahead, and she was confident in her driving abilities. What Rebecca didn't notice was the pair of headlights that had been following her since she'd stopped for gas in Grand Forks. The driver of the battered pickup truck maintained a careful distance, never getting close enough to make her suspicious, but never falling far enough behind to lose sight of her distinctive red Camaro. Detective Franklin Wade would later piece together that the stalking had likely begun much earlier, perhaps even back in Fargo, where the predator might have spotted Rebecca at the college campus or followed her from her part-time job at the campus bookstore. The methodical nature of what followed suggested this was not a random encounter, but a carefully planned abduction. At 10:47 p.m., according to the logbook at the Highway Patrol Station in Devil's Lake, Trooper Michael Brennan clocked a red Camaro traveling eastbound at 83 miles per hour in a 65 zone. The traffic stop was routine. Rebecca was polite and apologetic, explaining that she was running late to meet her boyfriend and hadn't realized how fast she was going. Brennan issued her a warning and sent her on her way, noting her Minnesota destination and the approximate time she should arrive. It was the last confirmed sighting of Rebecca Holloway alive. Tommy Richardson paced his apartment until 2 a.m., checking his watch every few minutes and peering out the window for any sign of headlights in the parking lot. By dawn, when Rebecca still hadn't arrived and wasn't answering her dormitory phone back in Fargo, he called the North Dakota Highway Patrol. Maybe she decided to turn back because of the storm, the dispatcher suggested. Lots of folks got spooked by that weather front last night. But Tommy knew Rebecca. She was stubborn and independent, the kind of person who would drive through a blizzard before admitting defeat. Something was wrong. The search began with standard protocols. Patrol units driving Rebecca's likely route, checking hospitals and towing services, putting out a bolo alert for the red Camaro with Minnesota plates reading Golden 1. Rebecca's parents, Robert and Margaret Holloway, drove the route themselves, stopping at every gas station and diner to show her photograph and ask if anyone had seen their daughter. For 3 days, hope remained alive. The storm had been severe enough to cause multiple accidents and road closures. Perhaps Rebecca had gotten stuck somewhere, or had car trouble in a remote area where help hadn't yet reached her. Then the ice fishermen made their grisly discovery. On the fourth morning after Rebecca's disappearance, two brothers from the nearby town of Lakota were checking their tip-ups on the Red River when they spotted something dark beneath the ice near the old railroad bridge. At first glance, it looked like a submerged log or debris from the recent storm. But as they moved closer, the shape became horrifyingly recognizable. The call came into the Pembina County Sheriff's Department at 11:23 a.m. Sheriff Harold Gutterson and Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Dr. Patricia Lynn arrived at the scene within 40 minutes, along with Detective Wade from the North Dakota Bureau of Criminal Investigation. What they found beneath 2 feet of ice and snow would fuel nightmares for years to come. Rebecca's body was perfectly preserved by the frigid water, floating face down in a shallow eddy where the current had deposited her against a fallen tree. Her long blonde hair fanned out like golden seaweed, and she was still wearing the blue wool coat her mother had bought her for Christmas. But the coat was torn, and even through the ice, the investigators could see evidence of violence. The recovery operation took 6 hours. Emergency crews had to use chainsaws and ice picks to create an opening large enough to reach the body, while a growing crowd of townspeople gathered on the riverbank despite the bitter cold. Word traveled fast in small farming communities, and by evening everyone within 50 miles knew that the missing college girl had been found. Dr. Lynn's preliminary examination revealed what would later be confirmed in the full autopsy. Rebecca had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed multiple times before being thrown into the river. But perhaps most disturbing was the evidence suggesting she had been held captive for several days before her murder: rope marks on her wrists and ankles, defensive wounds on her hands, and signs of prolonged trauma. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong or a crime of passion. Detective Wade told Sheriff Gutterson as they stood in the morgue's harsh fluorescent lighting. Someone took their time with this girl. Someone who planned it. The bridge, where blood evidence was later discovered, sat 3 miles upstream from where Rebecca's body was found. It was an isolated spot, a decrepit wooden structure built in the 1920s to carry grain trucks across the river during harvest season. Local kids sometimes used it for fishing or drinking parties, but in February, with temperatures well below zero, it was completely deserted. The blood spatter patterns told a story that would haunt investigators for decades. Rebecca had been forced to her knees on the bridge's wooden planks, where she was stabbed 7 times in a ritualistic pattern across her chest and abdomen. The killer had then rolled her body off the bridge, letting the current carry her downstream toward her final resting place. But the most puzzling aspect of the crime scene was what wasn't there: any sign of Rebecca's distinctive red Camaro. The car had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. Despite roadblocks, search teams, and a reward posted by Rebecca's parents, no trace of the vehicle was found. It was as though the North Dakota prairie had opened up and swallowed it whole. Detective Wade spent sleepless nights studying maps of the region, trying to figure out where someone could hide a car in the flat, sparsely populated farmland. There were abandoned barns and grain silos scattered across the landscape, but most were on private property that had been searched multiple times. The car had to be somewhere. Vehicles didn't just disappear into thin air. As word of the murder spread, the small farming communities of the Red River Valley locked their doors and watched their daughters more carefully. This wasn't the kind of crime that happened in their quiet corner of the world. Violent death was supposed to be something that occurred in big cities, not in a place where everyone knew their neighbors, and the biggest excitement was the annual county fair. The investigation quickly expanded beyond local resources. The FBI sent agents from their Minneapolis field office, and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension provided additional forensic support. A task force was assembled with representatives from 4 different law enforcement agencies, all focused on finding Rebecca's killer. But as the weeks turned into months, the leads grew colder. The killer had left virtually no physical evidence at the crime scene, No fingerprints, no tire tracks in the frozen ground, no witnesses who could provide a useful description. It was as if Rebecca had been murdered by a ghost. The only potential breakthrough came from an unexpected source, a series of reported sightings of Rebecca and her car in the days following her disappearance. Truck drivers claimed to have seen the red Camaro at rest stops hundreds of miles away. Gas station attendants reported serving a young blonde woman who matched Rebecca's description. A hotel clerk in Sioux Falls insisted that Rebecca had checked in alone, seeming nervous and distracted. But these sightings occurred after the medical examiner had determined Rebecca was already dead, creating a puzzle that defied explanation. Either the witnesses were mistaken, or something far more sinister was happening, something that suggested the killer wasn't working alone. Detective Wade interviewed each witness personally, driving thousands of miles across the upper Midwest to verify their stories. Most of the accounts were vague or contradictory, easily dismissed as cases of mistaken identity, but a few were disturbingly specific, provided by reliable witnesses who seemed genuinely certain of what they had seen. Martha Hendrickson, a waitress at a truck stop near Moorhead, Minnesota, swore she had served coffee to a young woman, matching Rebecca's description 3 days after the body was found. She had that same blonde hair, same blue eyes, Martha insisted, and she kept checking her watch like she was waiting for someone. When I asked if she was okay, she just nodded and left money on the table without saying a word. Even more puzzling was the account of State Trooper James Mitchell, who reported seeing a red Camaro with Minnesota plates speeding south on Interstate 35 near Albert Lea, a full week after Rebecca's body was discovered. When he attempted to pursue the vehicle, it had vanished at the next exit, as if the driver knew exactly where to go to avoid detection. These sightings created a chilling possibility that someone was deliberately impersonating Rebecca, driving her car around the region to confuse the investigation and create false leads. But why would someone take such an enormous risk? And where was this mysterious accomplice hiding the car between sightings? The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted a picture of a highly organized killer, someone who planned meticulously, operated with extreme caution, and likely had extensive knowledge of the local terrain. The ritualistic nature of the stabbing wounds suggested deep-seated psychological issues, possibly stemming from childhood trauma or previous violent encounters. This person has probably killed before. Dr. Sarah Kellerman, the FBI's chief profiler, told the task force during a briefing in early April. The level of control and organization we're seeing here doesn't develop overnight. There may be other victims we haven't connected to this perpetrator yet. The possibility of additional victims sent shockwaves through the investigation. Detective Wade began reviewing unsolved missing persons cases from across the upper Midwest, looking for patterns that might connect to Rebecca's murder. What he found was deeply troubling. Over the previous 5 years, at least 8 young women had disappeared under similar circumstances in a corridor stretching from North Dakota through Minnesota and into Wisconsin. Most were college-aged, blonde, and traveling alone when they vanished. Their bodies were either never found or discovered in remote waterways weeks or months later. The pattern suggested a serial killer who understood how to exploit the vast, sparsely populated landscape of the American heartland. Someone who could make victims disappear in the endless expanse of farmland and forest, where a scream for help might go unheard for miles. But identifying a pattern was only the first step. Finding the killer would require a breakthrough that seemed increasingly unlikely as the investigation dragged on through the spring and into summer. The task force followed hundreds of leads, interviewed thousands of potential witnesses, and coordinated with law enforcement agencies across multiple states. By autumn, the case was officially classified as cold, though Detective Wade refused to give up. He kept Rebecca's file on his desk, studying the crime scene photos and witness statements during quiet moments, convinced that somewhere in the mountain of evidence was a clue that would crack the case wide open. What Wade didn't know was that the killer was still out there, watching the investigation's progress from the shadows and planning his next move. In a remote farmstead 40 miles from where Rebecca's body was found, something evil was waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike again. And buried beneath a grove of cottonwood trees on that same property, Rebecca's red Camaro sat in the darkness, its golden license plates now a mocking reminder of a young woman's dreams that would never be fulfilled. The wind that had howled across the prairie on the night of Rebecca's disappearance continued to blow through the Red River Valley, carrying with it secrets that would remain buried for decades to come. But Detective Wade's instincts were correct. Somewhere in those files lay the key to catching a killer who thought he was untouchable. He just didn't know that the answer was closer than he imagined. Hidden in plain sight in a community where everyone trusted their neighbors, and no one suspected that evil could wear such a familiar face. 18 months after Rebecca Holloway's murder, the October wind carried the scent of burning leaves across the vast expanse of North Dakota farmland, where harvest time brought both celebration and an underlying sense of unease that had settled over the Red River Valley like a persistent fog. Detective Franklin Wade stood in his office on the 3rd floor of the Bismarck Courthouse, studying a wall map dotted with red pins, each one marking the location where a young woman had vanished without a trace. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. Since Rebecca's death, 3 more women had disappeared along the same corridor of highways that stretched from Fargo through Grand Forks and into Minnesota. Each victim fit the same horrifying profile: college-aged, blonde, traveling alone, and last seen driving distinctive vehicles that seemed to evaporate into the prairie landscape as completely as their owners. Jennifer Lynn Martinez, 20, had vanished in July while driving her powder blue Volkswagen Beetle from Moorhead to visit friends in Duluth. The car bore custom Minnesota plates reading Sunshine, making it as memorable as Rebecca's red Camaro. Despite massive search efforts and a reward that now totaled $15,000, neither Jennifer nor her vehicle had been found. 2 months later, Patricia Ann Kowalski disappeared during what should have been a routine drive from the University of North Dakota campus to her family's farm near Grafton. Her yellow Ford Mustang with the personalized plates Golden Eagle vanished somewhere along Highway 81, the same stretch of road where Rebecca had last been seen alive. Most recently, Catherine Rose Murphy had failed to arrive at her sister's wedding in Duluth, after leaving her apartment in Grand Forks on a crisp September morning. Her emerald green Chevelle SS, sporting the distinctive plates Irish Rose, had simply dissolved into the vast emptiness of the northern plains. Wade pressed his palms against the cool window glass and stared out at the courthouse parking lot below, where a few early snowflakes drifted past the streetlights. Somewhere out there, a predator was hunting with methodical precision, targeting young women whose personalized license plates made them easy to identify and follow. But what chilled Wade to his core was the growing certainty that this killer wasn't just taking lives, he was collecting trophies. The phone rang, jarring him from his brooding contemplation. The voice on the other end belonged to Agent Victoria Torres from the FBI's Minneapolis field office, and her tone carried an urgency that made Wade's stomach clench. "Franklin, we've got another sighting," Torres said, without preamble. Catherine Murphy's Chevelle was spotted at a truck stop near Hibbing, Minnesota, 3 hours ago. The witness is a state trooper, completely reliable. He ran the plates and got a hit on our Bolo alert. Wade felt his pulse quicken. Did he approach the vehicle? Negative. By the time he circled back through the parking lot, it was gone. But Franklin, Torres paused, and Wade could hear papers rustling in the background. The trooper swears he saw a young woman with long red hair behind the wheel. Catherine Murphy was a redhead. The implications hit Wade like a physical blow. If the sighting was accurate, it meant Catherine was still alive, nearly 3 weeks after her disappearance. But it also suggested something far more sinister than a simple murder case. Someone was keeping these women alive, using them and their vehicles in some elaborate psychological game that law enforcement was only beginning to understand. "I'm driving up there tonight," Wade announced, already reaching for his coat. "Can you meet me at the scene?" "Already en route," Torres replied. "And Franklin? Bring everything you have on the previous sightings. I think we're dealing with something a lot more complex than a serial killer." The truck stop where Catherine's car had been spotted sat at the intersection of two major highways, surrounded by miles of dense forest that stretched northward toward the Canadian border. It was the kind of place where long-haul truckers stopped for coffee and diesel fuel, where hunters paused during deer season, and where someone could easily disappear into the wilderness if they knew the right logging roads. Wade arrived at the scene just after midnight, his headlights cutting through a light snowfall that was beginning to accumulate on the pavement. Agent Torres was already there, interviewing Trooper Kevin McDonald under the harsh fluorescent lights of the truck stop's canopy. "Tell Detective Wade exactly what you told me," Torres instructed as Wade approached. McDonald was a 15-year veteran of the Minnesota State Patrol, the kind of cop who noticed details and didn't make mistakes about license plate numbers. He spoke with the measured precision of someone who had testified in court hundreds of times. "I was southbound on Highway 69 when I noticed the Chevelle at pump number 4, McDonald began, consulting his notebook. "Emerald green, just like the description in the Bolo alert. The plates read Irish Rose, Minnesota registration. I was certain it was the vehicle we've been looking for." "What about the driver?" Wade asked. "Young woman, early 20s, long red hair down to her shoulders. She was wearing a dark jacket, maybe navy blue or black. She appeared to be alone in the vehicle." Torres leaned forward. "Did she seem distressed? Was there any indication she was being held against her will?" McDonald shook his head slowly. "That's what's bothering me. She looked normal, calm. She filled up the tank, went inside to pay, came back out, and drove away. If I hadn't recognized the plates, I never would have given her a second look." Wade and Torres exchanged glances. This matched the pattern from the other sightings. Witnesses describing the missing women as appearing relaxed and untroubled, showing no signs of distress or coercion. It was as if they were willing participants in their own disappearances. "Which direction did she go when she left?" Wade asked. "North on 69 toward Grand Rapids. I tried to follow, but I got called to an accident scene about 2 miles down the road. By the time I finished there and went looking for the Chevelle, it had vanished." Wade walked to the edge of the truck stop's parking lot and stared north into the darkness. Highway 69 led deep into the Chippewa National Forest, where thousands of square miles of wilderness could hide almost anything. If the killer had a base of operations somewhere in that vast expanse of woods and lakes, it would explain how the victims and their vehicles could appear and disappear with such mysterious regularity. But it didn't explain why Catherine Murphy had looked so normal, so untroubled. Either she wasn't being held captive, or something far more sinister was happening, something that went beyond physical restraint into the realm of psychological manipulation. The breakthrough Wade had been hoping for came from an unexpected source 3 days later. Margaret Whitfield, a psychiatrist at the University of Minnesota who specialized in trauma and memory disorders, called the task force with a theory that sent chills through every investigator on the case. "I've been following your investigation in the newspapers," Dr. Whitfield explained during a conference call that included Wade, Torres, and Sheriff Gutterson. "The pattern of sightings you're describing, victims appearing normal and untroubled weeks after their disappearance, suggests the possibility of drug-induced amnesia." "What kind of drugs?" Torres. "There are several pharmaceutical compounds that can induce temporary memory loss while leaving the victim conscious and apparently functional," Whitfield explained. Rohypnol is the most commonly known, but there are others, experimental drugs that were developed for legitimate medical purposes but could be misused by someone with the right knowledge. Wade felt pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place. So these women might not remember being kidnapped. It's possible. With the right combination of drugs and psychological manipulation, a skilled perpetrator could create a dissociative state where the victim believes they're acting of their own free will. They might think they're simply taking a longer route to their destination, or that they decided to take an impromptu vacation. The implications were staggering. If Dr. Whitfield's theory was correct, the missing women might be alive but trapped in a pharmaceutical prison, their memories and judgment so compromised that they couldn't recognize their own captivity. It would explain why they appeared calm during the sightings, why they seemed to be acting normally despite being miles from where they should be. But it also raised a terrifying question. What was the killer's ultimate purpose? Why keep the women alive for weeks or months? What was he planning to do with them? The answer began to emerge when Wade received a call from the Beltrami County Sheriff's Department in northern Minnesota. A local hunter had discovered what appeared to be a crude campsite deep in the Chippewa National Forest, a site that showed signs of recent occupation and contained several disturbing items that suggested it might be connected to the missing women. Wade and Torres drove north through the early November snow, following logging roads that grew progressively narrower and more isolated as they penetrated deeper into the wilderness. The campsite was located nearly 30 miles from the nearest paved road, accessible only by four-wheel drive vehicles and snowmobiles. What they found there would haunt their dreams for years to come. The site consisted of 3 small cabins arranged in a rough triangle around a central fire pit. 2 of the cabins appeared to be living quarters, equipped with beds, propane heaters, and basic amenities. The third was larger and had been converted into what could only be described as a workshop, but not for any legitimate craft. Inside the workshop, investigators found a collection of women's clothing carefully arranged on hangers, each outfit tagged with a name and date. Rebecca Holloway's blue wool coat hung next to Jennifer Martinez's college sweatshirt. Patricia Kowalski's favorite sweater was displayed beside Catherine Murphy's leather jacket. But perhaps most chilling was the discovery of a sophisticated chemical laboratory in the corner of the workshop, equipment for manufacturing and refining drugs, along with detailed notebooks documenting experiments in memory suppression and behavioral modification. The notebooks, written in precise handwriting, read like a madman's guide to psychological torture. They contained formulas for drug cocktails designed to induce specific mental states, detailed observations of how different victims responded to various treatments, and horrifyingly clinical notes about the subject's behavior during different phases of captivity. One entry, dated just 2 weeks earlier, made Wade's blood run cold. Subject C shows continued resistance to long-term conditioning. Increased dosage of compound 7A has improved compliance, but periodic memory fragments suggest incomplete suppression. May need to accelerate timeline for final phase. Consider moving to permanent solution within 30 days. Jesus Christ, Torres whispered as she read over Wade's shoulder. This isn't just murder, it's systematic torture. The search of the remaining cabins revealed evidence that at least 2 women had been held at the site recently. Fresh food in the refrigerator, toiletries, and clothes that matched the descriptions of missing victims suggested the camp was still active, but there was no sign of the women themselves or of their vehicles. What they did find was a detailed map of the region, with dozens of locations marked in red ink. Coordinates that, when checked, corresponded to remote lakes, abandoned mine shafts, and other isolated spots where bodies or vehicles could be disposed of permanently. Wade studied the map with growing horror, realizing that they were looking at the killing ground of a methodical predator who had been operating undetected for years. The campsite was just the tip of the iceberg. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness were the final resting places of victims whose disappearances had never even been connected to this case. As night fell and the temperature dropped below freezing, the task force established a perimeter around the campsite and settled in for what they hoped would be a long surveillance operation. If the killer was still using this location, he would eventually return. When he did, they would be ready. But the killer was closer than they imagined, and he had been watching them since they first arrived at his sanctuary. From his concealed position in a deer blind 300 yards away, Arthur Cornelius Brennan observed the law enforcement activity through high-powered binoculars. his weathered face showing no emotion despite the fact that his carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. Brennan was a 42-year-old former chemistry professor who had lost his position at the University of Minnesota 5 years earlier, following allegations of conducting unauthorized experiments on graduate students. The charges had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but his academic career was ruined. He had retreated to the family farm inherited from his grandparents, where he had spent the past 5 years perfecting his techniques on a series of carefully selected victims. The irony wasn't lost on him that his own nephew, Trooper Michael Brennan, was among the officers who had been searching for him. Arthur had been following the investigation through police scanner frequencies and newspaper reports, always staying one step ahead of the dragnet that was slowly closing around him. But now they had found his laboratory, his records, his life's work. Everything he had built in this remote corner of the wilderness was finished. It was time to implement the final phase of his plan, the one he had been saving for exactly this kind of emergency. Brennan lowered the binoculars and checked his watch. In 6 hours at dawn, he would begin the endgame. Catherine Murphy and Jennifer Martinez, the 2 women currently being held at his backup facility 40 miles to the north, would play their final roles in his grand experiment. Their deaths would send a message to the investigators that they were dealing with someone far more sophisticated than they had imagined. And then Arthur Brennan would disappear forever, taking with him the secrets of what had happened to Rebecca Holloway and the other women whose bodies would never be found. He had escape routes prepared, new identities established, and enough money hidden in offshore accounts to start over anywhere in the world. As he made his way through the dark forest toward his vehicle, Brennan allowed himself a thin smile. The game was far from over. In fact, the most interesting phase was just beginning. Back at the campsite, Detective Wade stood in the doorway of the workshop, studying the collection of victims' clothing by flashlight. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a killer was still free, and at least 2 women were still missing. The discovery of this site was a major breakthrough, but it also revealed the true scope of the horror they were facing. Wade pulled out his radio and called for additional resources, search teams, forensic specialists, and psychological profilers. They were no longer hunting a simple serial killer. They were pursuing a madman who had turned murder into a science and who had been operating in their midst for years without detection. The wind howled through the trees around the abandoned campsite, carrying with it the promise of another brutal winter. But for the first time since Rebecca Holloway's body had been pulled from the Red River, Wade felt they were finally closing in on the truth. What he didn't know was that the killer had already anticipated this moment and was prepared to make the investigators pay a terrible price for their discovery. In a hidden facility deep in the Minnesota wilderness, 2 young women sat in drugged stupor, unaware that their lives hung by the thinnest of thread. Dawn was still hours away, but Arthur Brennan was already preparing for the final act of his twisted play, one that would shock the investigators and demonstrate just how far ahead of them he had always been. The hunt was about to become infinitely more dangerous. Dawn broke gray and cold over the Chippewa National Forest on November 15, 1976. As Detective Franklin Wade crouched behind a fallen pine tree, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. For 12 hours, the task force had maintained their vigil around Arthur Brennan's abandoned campsite, waiting for a killer who seemed to have vanished into the vast wilderness like smoke. But Wade's instincts told him Brennan was still close, watching, planning, preparing for whatever twisted finale he had in mind. The radio crackled softly in Wade's earpiece. Agent Torres's voice was barely above a whisper. Movement on the north perimeter. Single individual approaching on foot. Approximately 200 yards out. Wade's pulse quickened. After 18 months of chasing shadows and false leads, they were finally about to confront the monster who had terrorized the Red River Valley. He checked his service weapon and adjusted his position behind the tree, keeping his eyes fixed on the tree line where Torres had spotted the approaching figure. What emerged from the forest wasn't what any of them expected. Catherine Murphy stumbled into the clearing around the campsite, her long red hair matted and dirty, her clothes torn and stained. She moved with the jerky, uncertain gait of someone heavily drugged, her eyes unfocused and glassy. In her right hand, she clutched a folded piece of paper. "Hold your positions," Wade whispered into his radio. "This could be a trap." Catherine wandered aimlessly around the campsite for several minutes, occasionally stopping to stare at objects as if trying to remember their significance. When she reached the central fire pit, she sat down heavily on a log and began to cry deep, wrenching sobs that echoed through the silent forest. Wade made the decision to approach. Rising slowly from his concealment, he holstered his weapon and walked toward Catherine with his hands visible, speaking in the calm, reassuring tone he used with trauma victims. "Catherine, my name is Detective Wade. You're safe now. We're here to help you." She looked up at him with confusion and terror, her pupils dilated to the point where her green eyes appeared almost black. I don't know how I got here," she whispered. "I was supposed to be at my sister's wedding. Where am I? What happened to me?" Wade knelt beside her, noting the rope burns on her wrists and the needle marks on her arms that indicated prolonged drug injection. "You're in northern Minnesota, Catherine. You've been missing for 3 weeks. Do you remember anything about how you got here?" Catherine shook her head, then suddenly remembered the paper in her hand. She held it out to Wade with trembling fingers. "He told me to give this to the police, said it was important." Wade took the note, his skin crawling as he recognized the same precise handwriting from the laboratory notebooks. The message was brief but chilling. "Detective Wade, by the time you read this, the final phase will have begun. Jennifer is with me at coordinates 47-1N90403729. W. You have exactly 4 hours to reach her before she joins Rebecca in the river. Come alone, or she dies immediately. No helicopters, no backup teams, no radio contact. This is between you and me now. Ace. P.S. Tell my nephew Michael that Uncle Arthur always appreciated his dedication to law enforcement." Wade felt his blood turn to ice. Trooper Michael Brennan, the same officer who had stopped Rebecca Holloway for speeding on the night she disappeared. The family connection explained how Arthur Brennan had stayed one step ahead of the investigation. He had been receiving inside information about police activities from his own nephew, Torres. Wade called out, "Get a medic for Catherine and coordinate the coordinates in this note, and put out an immediate APB for Trooper Michael Brennan. Consider him armed and extremely dangerous." Agent Torres rushed over, reading the note over Wade's shoulder. "Franklin, you can't seriously be considering going in there alone. It's obviously a trap." "Of course it's a trap," Wade replied grimly. "But Jennifer Martinez is still alive, and she'll die if we don't follow his instructions. We don't have a choice." The coordinates led to an abandoned iron ore mine, 30 miles deeper into the wilderness, a place where the ground was honeycombed with flooded shafts and unstable tunnels that had been closed since the night. It was the perfect location for a final confrontation, isolated enough that screams would go unheard, and treacherous enough that a single misstep could prove fatal. Wade made the drive in his four-wheel drive pickup, following logging roads that grew progressively worse as he penetrated deeper into the forest. The coordinates led him to a rusted gate marked with faded warning signs about mine hazards and toxic water. Beyond the gate, a narrow track wound downhill toward what had once been the main mining complex. The silence was oppressive as Wade parked his truck and continued on foot. No birds sang in the bare trees, and even the wind seemed muted in this desolate place. The remains of industrial buildings dotted the landscape, concrete foundations, rusted machinery, and the dark mouths of mine shafts that descended into the earth like gates to hell. Wade found Jennifer Martinez chained to a support beam inside the ruins of the main processing building. She was unconscious but alive, her breathing shallow and labored. Like Catherine, she showed signs of prolonged drug abuse and physical trauma. A timer device sat nearby, its digital display counting down, 47 minutes and 23 seconds. Touching scene, isn't it? Wade spun around to find Arthur Brennan standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray sky. He was a thin, unremarkable man in his early 40s, with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him the appearance of a college professor, which Wade realized he had been before his descent into madness. "Dr. Arthur Brennan," Wade said, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "We've been looking for you for a long time." Brennan smiled, a cold, clinical expression that never reached his eyes. "Please, detective. After all we've been through together, call me Arthur. I feel like we know each other quite well by now." "Why?" Wade asked, the question that had haunted him for 18 months. "Why Rebecca? Why any of them?" "You wouldn't understand," Brennan replied, moving closer with the predatory grace of a stalking cat. "Your mind is too limited, too conventional. What I've accomplished here represents a breakthrough in understanding human consciousness, the ability to reshape memory, to control behavior, to reduce the human experience to its most basic components." "You're talking about torture and murder." Brennan's expression hardened. "I'm talking about science, detective. Pure research unencumbered by the artificial constraints of ethics committees and institutional oversight. Each of my subjects contributed valuable data to our understanding of the human psyche under extreme stress." Wade noticed that Brennan's hands were empty, no visible weapons. But the man's confidence suggested he had other advantages in this isolated location. Wade needed to keep him talking while looking for opportunities to free Jennifer and escape. "What about your nephew, Michael? Was he part of your research too?" For the first time, Brennan's composure wavered slightly. "Michael was useful, a source of information about police activities. But he never understood the true nature of what I was accomplishing. He thought he was helping solve crimes, not realizing he was enabling something far more significant." "Where is he now?" Brennan's smile returned. "Poor Michael suffered an unfortunate accident earlier this morning. Carbon monoxide poisoning in his garage. Very tragic. The guilt of inadvertently helping a serial killer apparently became too much for him to bear." The casual way Brennan discussed his nephew's murder confirmed what Wade already knew. They were dealing with a complete psychopath, someone for whom human life had no value beyond its research potential. The timer on the device beside Jennifer now showed less than 40 minutes remaining. Wade could see wires leading from the device to what appeared to be explosives attached to the support beam. When the timer reached 0, the entire building would collapse into one of the flooded mine shafts below. "You're planning to kill all three of us," Wade observed. "Not all three," Brennan corrected. "I've prepared an escape route for myself, but you and Miss Martinez will serve as the finale to my research project. The psychological stress you're experiencing right now, knowing you have less than 40 minutes to live, will provide valuable data about decision-making under extreme pressure." Brennan pulled out a small recording device and set it on a nearby table. "Please feel free to speak your thoughts aloud. Any insights into your mental state during these final minutes would be greatly appreciated." Wade realized that Brennan's arrogance might be his weakness. The man was so convinced of his intellectual superiority that he hadn't considered Wade might have planned for this contingency. "You made one mistake, Arthur," Wade said, slowly reaching into his jacket pocket. "You assumed I followed your instructions exactly." Brennan's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Wade pulled out a small radio transmitter and pressed the activation button. "I said I came alone. I didn't say I came unprepared." The explosion that followed wasn't the building collapsing. It was a carefully placed breaching charge that Torres and her team had positioned while Wade kept Brennan distracted. The blast took out the wall behind Brennan, and FBI agents poured through the opening with weapons drawn. But Brennan had one final surprise. As the agents moved to surround him, he pulled a small device from his pocket, a remote detonator for the explosives attached to the building's support structure. "One more step and we all die together," he announced calmly. The standoff lasted for nearly 10 minutes, with Brennan holding the detonator while agents tried to position themselves for a clean shot. Meanwhile, the timer beside Jennifer continued its relentless countdown. 15 minutes, 14. The resolution came from an unexpected source. Jennifer Martinez, despite being heavily drugged, had regained enough consciousness to understand what was happening. While everyone's attention was focused on Brennan, she managed to work her hand free from the loosely fastened chain around her wrist. When Brennan moved closer to gloat over Wade's failed rescue attempt, Jennifer grabbed his ankle and pulled with all her remaining strength. Brennan stumbled, the detonator flying from his hand as he tried to maintain his balance. Agent Torres put 3 bullets in Arthur Brennan's chest before the detonator hit the ground. The cleanup took 3 days. Bomb disposal experts disarmed the explosive device with only minutes to spare, while search teams scoured the mine complex for additional evidence and booby traps. What they found painted a picture of systematic torture and murder that went back far longer than anyone had imagined. In addition to the victims connected to the Red River Valley case, investigators discovered evidence linking Brennan to at least 12 other disappearances across the upper Midwest. His laboratory notes contained detailed records of experiments conducted on victims who were never identified, their bodies disposed of in the countless flooded mine shafts that dotted the region. The discovery of Rebecca Holloway's red Camaro in a concealed garage on Brennan's family property provided the final piece of the puzzle. The car had been perfectly preserved, along with the vehicles belonging to Jennifer Martinez and Patricia Kowalski. Catherine Murphy's Chevelle was found at another location, part of Brennan's plan to use the cars in psychological manipulation of his victims. Jennifer Martinez and Catherine Murphy both survived their ordeal, though the psychological trauma and effects of prolonged drug exposure would require years of therapy to overcome. Their testimony helped prosecutors piece together the full scope of Brennan's crimes, though many details would never be known due to the systematic destruction of evidence. The revelation of Trooper Michael Brennan's unwitting assistance to his uncle sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the region. His suicide note, found beside his body in the carbon monoxide-filled garage, expressed his horror at realizing how his routine police reports had been used to target victims and stay ahead of the investigation. Detective Franklin Wade was promoted to chief of detectives 6 months later, but the triumph felt hollow given the scope of the tragedy they had uncovered. He kept Rebecca Holloway's case file on his desk as a reminder that evil could hide behind the most ordinary facades, and that vigilance was the price of protecting the innocent. On a cold February morning in 1977, exactly 3 years after Rebecca's murder, Wade stood once again on the old railroad bridge over the Red River where her body had been found. A small memorial plaque had been installed there, bearing the names of all the victims they had identified. The wind still howled across the frozen landscape, but the shadows that had haunted the Red River Valley for so long had finally been banished. Arthur Brennan's reign of terror was over, his victims finally at peace. As Wade turned to walk back to his car, he noticed a familiar figure standing by the riverbank, Robert Holloway, Rebecca's father, placing fresh flowers beside the memorial plaque. The 2 men nodded to each other in silent understanding. Justice had finally been served, but the scars left by Arthur Brennan's twisted experiments would take generations to heal. The case officially closed on March 15, 1977, when the last of the evidence was catalogued and filed away. But for Wade and the other investigators who had lived through those 18 months of horror, the memories would never fade. They had stared into the abyss of human evil and emerged scarred, but victorious. Arthur Cornelius Brennan died as he had lived, believing himself to be superior to those around him, convinced that his twisted research justified the suffering he had caused. His final words, spoken to Detective Wade as paramedics worked frantically to save his life, were typically arrogant. "You'll never understand what I accomplished here. My work will outlive all of you." But Brennan was wrong. His work died with him, leaving behind only grief and trauma. What survived was the memory of his victims, young women whose lives had been cut short, but who would never be forgotten by those who fought to bring their killer to justice. In the years that followed, the abandoned mine complex was permanently sealed, and the forests slowly reclaimed the industrial ruins where so much suffering had taken place. Hunters and hikers occasionally reported strange sounds echoing from the sealed mine shafts, but most locals avoided the area entirely, knowing the dark history that lay buried beneath the peaceful facade of the Minnesota wilderness. The Red River continued to flow northward toward Hudson Bay, carrying with it the secrets of the past and the promise of better days ahead. The shadows that had haunted its banks for so long were finally gone, banished by the courage of investigators who refused to give up, and the determination of a community that would not let evil triumph. Detective Wade retired in 1985, his career defined by the case that had consumed nearly 2 years of his life. He spent his retirement years writing a book about the investigation, donating all proceeds to organizations that supported victims of violent crime. The book became a bestseller, helping to ensure that Rebecca Holloway and the other victims would be remembered not just as statistics, but as real people whose lives had meaning and value. Arthur Brennan's name faded from memory, as it should have, but the courage and dedication of those who brought him to justice became part of the folklore of the Red River Valley, a reminder that even in the darkest times, there are those willing to stand against evil and fight for justice. The wind that had carried the scent of death and fear across the northern plains for so long now brought only the clean smell of snow and pine. The nightmare was over, and the healing could finally begin.